Just now on the central economic policy of this Trump administration, in a huge blow to the White House and its agenda, and a big win, I would say, for everyone else, a federal appeals court has just ruled that Trump's sprawling tariffs are unlawful and invalid. Of course, the president has been obsessed with imposing his willy-nilly tariffs on Americans. In fact, it has been the central plank of his entire economic agenda. Now, it has been wildly unpopular. It's polling underwater. It is costing consumers and corporations billions and billions of dollars by the day. It's stopping the Fed from cutting interest rates by driving inflation. It has, on the whole, been really bad economic policy. And most of the discussion of these tariffs have been focused on that. But there's also something about these tariffs, which is that from the jump, they've been pretty clearly illegal. I mean, think about it for a second. Can the president just by himself create tariffs that raise hundreds of billions of dollars with zero congressional input? These tariffs are a violation of the law that they purport to use as the justification, and a violation of the spirit of the Constitution of a country which was quite literally founded on the belief the executive cannot unilaterally just impose a tax without representation, specifically tariffs. Now, the Trump administration has claimed that its tariff regime and the reciprocal tariffs that it has, and those on China and Mexico and Canada, that those are an emergency measure under a 1974 law, and that made it illegal. Well, when this was challenged in a district court, the district court judge said, no way, this does not comport with the law. So the Department of Justice, acting as Trump's lawyers, appealed. And now, just 20 minutes ago, in a huge development, an appellate court has just upheld that ruling 7-4, the federal appellate circuit, saying it is illegal. All the tariffs you're citing are illegal. The emergency you claim is not a valid basis to break the law. Neil Katyal argued this case on behalf of the plaintiffs who just emerged victorious. He previously served as acting Solicitor General of the United States, and he joins me now. Neil, frame the argument that you made and what the court said about those arguments.
The global shipping network, particularly in the small parcel segment, experienced a significant slowdown on the 29th of August, as postal operators from Europe and Australia made the difficult decision to temporarily suspend or reduce shipments of low-value parcels to the United States. This shift was a direct response to a major change in U.S. tariffs, which has permanently eliminated the long-standing exemption that allowed small-value packages worth under $800 to enter the U.S. market duty-free. This exemption, known as the dimminimous rule, has been a key enabler of global e-commerce, facilitating the swift movement of millions of small parcels without the administrative burden of customs duties. However, with this exemption removed, all low-value parcels are now subject to new customs, duties, and taxes, creating significant disruption for international shipping operators and businesses. The rationale behind this dramatic change in the U.S. tariff system is rooted in a desire for greater revenue collection, improved security, and fairer competition for U.S. businesses. The U.S. government wants to close loopholes that allow low-value imports to bypass tariffs, thus protecting domestic manufacturers from being undercut by cheaper foreign goods. At the same time, the government aims to enhance the security of incoming shipments by ensuring that every parcel, regardless of its value, is properly declared, scanned for risk, and subjected to customs duties. The new regime requires importers to submit detailed data about the contents of each package, including the product code, value, origin, and buyer information. This shift has caused a significant disruption in both international shipping flows and the domestic U.S. market, particularly for industries relying on quick, low-cost imports of small items such as fashion accessories, electronic gadgets, and spare parts. For the past several years, small shipments from overseas could enter the U.S. market without customs duties as long as they fell under the $800 threshold. This facilitated rapid e-commerce growth, particularly for global sellers in Europe, China, and Australia, who relied on the ability to send low-cost items directly to U.S. consumers. However, the removal of this tariff exemption has now created a new level of complexity and cost for international shippers. The change means that every package, regardless of its size or value, must now undergo customs processing, including payment of taxes and the filing of detailed paperwork. This sudden shift has put significant pressure on postal operators, who were not prepared to implement these new requirements within such a short time frame. Many postal networks in Europe and Australia have found it impossible to quickly adapt to the new regime. Without the necessary software, personnel, and infrastructure to handle the increased data requirements and customs duties collection, postal services in countries like Germany, Belgium, and Australia have temporarily suspended shipments to the US or restricted them to very low-value personal items or documents only. Some countries have opted for partial suspensions, while others have redirected their customers to private express carriers, which are better equipped to handle the new customs procedures but come at a higher cost. Australia Post, for instance, made the decision to halt the flow of commercial packages, except for letters and small personal gifts, under $100, creating a substantial gap in the market for low-cost international shipping. The implications of this change are far-reaching, not just for consumers, but for small and medium-sized businesses, NSBs, and microsellers who are most vulnerable to the new tariff structure. In 2024 alone, approximately 1.36 billion packages entered the US under the old exemption, with an estimated market value of $64 to $65 billion. This high volume of small-value parcels was crucial to maintaining affordable pricing and fast delivery for US consumers. However, with the imposition of new customs, duties, and taxes, the cost of shipping low-value items has risen dramatically. To illustrate, a small accessory worth $12 that once could be shipped to the US with minimal costs is now subject to an $80 fixed customs fee during the 6-month transition period. This drastic increase in shipping costs makes it financially unfeasible for consumers to purchase such low-cost products, particularly in the face of rising inflation and economic uncertainty.
You're exactly right, Chris. You're doing excellent lawyering. I suspect it's in part due to your spouse, who's an amazing lawyer in her own right. But that's exactly right. The government is saying, in this case, the Trump administration is saying that in 1977, Congress passed a law that gave the president emergency economic powers. And the court today said, yeah, that's true. There's only one problem with that. That 1977 law says nothing whatsoever about tariffs. No president in the 50 years since that law was passed thought it had to do with tariffs. And as I said a moment ago, even Donald Trump didn't think it had to do with tariffs, because the first time around when he was president, he went to Congress to try and get the tariff authority that he's now asserting. And Congress said no. And I suspect, he's worried Congress would say no if he asks again, for all the reasons that you were explaining earlier.
One of the things here, and I want to read again from this decision here, that this is the sort of core of the holding. For the reasons discussed above, we discern no clear congressional authorization by IEEPA, that's the 1977 law for tariffs, of the magnitude of the reciprocal tariffs and the trafficking tariffs. Reading the phrase regulate importation, which is the statutory language they're citing, to include imposing these tariffs is a wafer-thin reed on which to rest such sweeping power. How confident were you about winning this case? I mean, you obviously had the lower court on your side, but also courts have been fairly deferential to presidential declarations of emergency powers.
Yeah, no, when you're challenging presidential action, if you're the president facing these challenges, you almost have to try to lose the case. It's like failing kindergarten. You got to try. But I think that's unfortunately where we were here. And that's why, I'm privileged not just to represent this myself, but with a whole group of very conservative folks. The Liberty Justice Center is the entity behind this, a libertarian organization. Judge Michael McConnell, a very prominent former judge, very conservative. It's not, this is, when you get to something like this, Chris, the Constitution is not political. It's a bipartisan document that speaks to all of us, and it sets certain ground rules. And one of those ground rules was enforced today. The idea that the president on his own can't tax the American people. That's what King George III tried to do. We had a revolution about that.
Yeah. On the operational side, postal networks, particularly in Europe, are struggling to keep up with the demands of the new system. Historically, postal services were designed to handle letter-based shipments and small parcels with minimal customs procedures. But now, with the introduction of detailed customs data requirements, postal operators need to collect a wide array of information, including product codes, the origin of goods, value, buyer details, and payment information, as well as calculate customs duties in real time. This requires new systems, new processes, and additional staffing, none of which can be implemented overnight. As a result, many operators have turned to express couriers like DHL, FedEx, and UPS, which are better equipped to handle these new customs demands. But these carriers come at a higher cost, further driving up prices for consumers. The shift from postal services to express carriers has led to significant changes in the international shipping landscape. Express carriers are better prepared to deal with the technical challenges posed by the new U.S. tariff regime, but their services are significantly more expensive. For businesses relying on small shipments of low-value items, this means that shipping costs have skyrocketed. To mitigate this, many businesses are turning to alternative solutions, such as setting up micro-warehouses within the U.S. to fulfill orders from domestic locations, bypassing the need for international shipping. However, this solution is only viable for larger companies with sufficient resources. Smaller businesses, particularly those producing niche or handmade products, are facing a much more difficult challenge, as they cannot afford to set up warehouses or absorb the increased shipping costs. In the short term, this transition is causing considerable disruption, especially for businesses that relied on fast and affordable international shipping to deliver low-value items to U.S. consumers. The new tariffs and customs duties have created a scenario where businesses either need to absorb the increased costs, pass them on to consumers, or find alternative solutions. Some businesses have opted to temporarily halt sales to the U.S. until they can figure out a way to adapt, while others are exploring the possibility of shipping from local warehouses within the U.S. to avoid the complex customs requirements. While large platforms like Amazon have the capacity to weather this storm, smaller sellers are struggling to adjust, as they cannot afford the additional costs or the complexity of navigating the new customs system. The long-term implications of these changes will be profound. As U.S. tariffs on low-value imports become permanent, businesses will need to adapt to a new normal, where customs duties are applied to every shipment, regardless of size or value. For many businesses, this will mean higher costs, longer delivery times, and potentially fewer options for consumers. However, the shift to a more regulated, transparent system could also have positive effects in the long run. The increased scrutiny on imports could reduce the flow of counterfeit goods, improve security, and create a more level playing field for U.S. manufacturers. For the postal operators themselves, this transition is far from simple. Postal services, particularly in Europe and Australia, are non-profit public institutions, and they are not equipped to handle the complexity of customs processing, which is typically handled by private sector firms. In the coming months, it will be critical for postal networks to invest in new systems, software, and infrastructure to handle the increased data and customs requirements. Some have already begun testing pilot programs and exploring partnerships with third-party customs collection platforms, which will eventually ease the burden on businesses. Until these systems are fully in place, however, many businesses and consumers will continue to experience delays, higher costs, and frustration. In the medium term, we can expect to see a shift towards the DDP, delivered duty paid, model becoming the default for international shipping. Under this model, the seller assumes responsibility for all duties and taxes, providing a more transparent and predictable experience for consumers. This model will become more common as businesses adjust to the new realities of U.S. tariffs, and as express carriers and third-party logistics providers become the primary means of handling international shipments. Smaller businesses will need to make significant changes to their operations, such as setting up U.S. warehouses or contracting with agents to handle customs duties, in order to remain competitive. As this new regime takes hold, it is clear that businesses, particularly SMBs, will face significant challenges. The increased complexity and cost of international shipping will have a lasting impact on how goods are traded across borders, especially for low-value